مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. مارس شهر غريب جدا في واشنطن. إنه بداية الربيع ولكن الجليد يتساقط. هو شهر غريب في السياسة الخارجية أيضا. خلال ساعات من فوز بنيامين نتنياهو المفاجئة في حملاته الانتخابية في إسرائيل، نشبت أزمة بالفعل في العلاقات بين الولايات المتحدة وإسرائيل. ولكن إن كانت أمريكا وحليفها الإقليمي الرئيسي يتعاركان، فإن إدارة أوباما لم تملك سوى الكلمات الرقيقة لإيران خصمها الإقليمي الرئيسي، إذ تحاول واشنطن وطهران التواصل إلى اتفاق تاريخي حول برنامج إيران النووي. بين إسرائيل وإيران يحاول ملايين العرب فهم معنى كل هذه التغيرات وما هي عواقب ذلك بالنسبة لهم، وما يجدر بهم فعله بهذا الشأن. لمناقشة التغيرات الجوهرية الجارية في السياسة الأمريكية حيال الشرق الأوسط، يسرني أن أرحب باللجنة المكونة من خبيري السياسة الخارجية دينيس روس ووان زراتي. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. I'm sitting here with our panel of foreign policy experts to discuss the topsy-turvy situation in the Middle East. Gentlemen, let's begin with Israel and U.S.-Israel relations. The Prime Minister of Israel scored a surprising and decisive electoral victory, and within hours of his victory, deep tensions again in the relationship between Washington and Jerusalem. Dennis, what's going on here?
Well, I do think that some of the statements that Prime Minister Netanyahu made at the end of the campaign, which were clearly designed to coalesce the right and ensure that the right didn't, in a sense, waste its votes by separating the votes. I think he made statements. Number one, the Arabs were voting in droves for him, and this was going to threaten and produce a left-wing government. And also his opposition to a Palestinian state, at least it was presented as his opposition to a Palestinian state. He actually said, there won't be a Palestinian state as long as he's prime minister. And the combination of those two, I think, set off very large alarm bells here. On the one hand, I think the Palestinian state meant, you're not for a two-state outcome any longer. That's led to talk about a reevaluation of what our policy is going to be. And I think the statement about the Arabs, I think that in some ways was actually much more of a troubling thing for the White House, and it felt in a lot of respects that this was a kind of unacceptable statement. You can disagree on policy, but this seemed much more fundamental. It seemed to get at whether or not Arabs who live in Israel have rights or not. And so I think it produced a reaction. The administration couldn't say anything when these things were stated because they didn't want to look like they were interfering in the election, but after the election, they've come out pretty clearly, even to the point of being skeptical about the prime minister's trying to reposition himself on those issues. I mean, one thing that surprised me on the two-state declaration, the two-state posture, I was surprised that, in a sense, the administration didn't seem to question whether this was really his position, the prime minister's position. I would have thought it would have made much more sense to welcome his clarification on two states and then say, we look forward to seeing that his policies are consistent with that statement. That would have still had a bit of an edge without suddenly saying, well, we don't believe what he said. So what you have right now is obviously a pretty high degree of tension in the relationship. And I think the administration is also trying to keep some pressure on to signal, look, if you want to change things, Prime Minister Netanyahu, you need to move more towards us and you need to make some amends.
Juan, Israel enjoys quite broad popularity here in the United States. Mm-hmm. How does this tension between the leaders and the leaderships play out domestically, and how does the domestic support for Israel impact the foreign policy approach?
Well, you saw this clearly with the visit of Bibi Netanyahu to speak before Congress, invited by the Republican House leader. welcomed with ovations and with much acclaim from the Republicans in large part reflecting what you've just described, Rob, which is a great deal of support for Israel in general terms, and certainly a great deal of respect for Benjamin Netanyahu. And so that plays out in different ways, and you saw that created internal tension and division within the U.S. System, because you had an administration that did not want to see Prime Minister Netanyahu right before the election coming to give a speech about Iran in the middle of Iranian negotiations. Lots of concern that this was political on all sides, and that foreign policy was starting to be used as a political football domestically for precisely the reasons you described. That this relationship is so important and so fundamental between the countries. But ultimately what you have here is a problem of both personality and policy, right? You have real dislike and tension, I think, between the leadership. And that matters in foreign policy. Dennis can tell you this better than anybody in the U.S. The relationship between the leaders matters. And the reality is it's poisoned. Part of this was the visit to Congress. The president didn't like that. He was obviously agitated and angry about that. But it's also an issue of policy. And I think the problem is when you have moments of policy division between two allies, and it's exacerbated by personality tension, and you're dealing with high-stakes issues, the Palestinian state question, the question of the Iranian nuclear discussions and diplomacy. All of that sort of begins to sort of feed on itself. And I think we're in a very bad moment, because I think we're at critical moments from a policy perspective and in terms of diplomacy. We're in a critical moment domestically in terms of how Israel is treated and how we think about these issues. And we're at a critical moment in terms of the demonstration effect, something you alluded to in your question. How is the rest of the world viewing America and the way it treats its allies and its relationships abroad? And so all of that is playing out, and unfortunately I think it's not playing out neatly as we watch this unfold.
Well, let me pursue this last part of the question. How do our allies, both in the Middle East and elsewhere, how do you think they understand, explain, and interpret this tension between countries they must normally think are close friends and partners?
You know, I think it creates confusion. In an interesting way, there's a convergence in the Middle East between the Israeli view of the Iranian problem, the Israeli view of Hamas, the Muslim Brother, and what I would call the Egyptian, Jordanian, Saudi, Emirati, largely the Sunni Arabs with the exception of Qatar. I think there's a real conversion of interest between, and perception of threat, between how they see both Iran and the Muslim Brotherhood. And they look at themselves sort of seeing a certain reality in the region, and they look at the administration and they question whether the administration gets what's happening in the region. They see the administration sort of prioritizing its nuclear deal with Iran to the exclusion of everything else that Iran is doing in the region. Here is Iran that is now seen as dominating 4 Arab capitals, Baghdad, Damascus, Beirut, and Sana'a. And they don't see a kind of alarm over that in the administration. On the contrary, they see what seems to be an extraordinarily energetic pursuit of a nuclear deal. And so they look at that, and they look at the Israelis. It's very interesting to see when Prime Minister Netanyahu came and gave his speech in the Congress, when you look at a lot of the Arab media reaction to it, one article in particular that I saw that was in Sheikh al-Assad was went at great length about how the assessment on Iran gobbling up countries, the changing regional balance of power, sense was this was exactly right. And so there is a kind of concern about where is the administration in terms of the region and how it defines its interests, and does it define its interests in a way that is consistent with how our traditional friends define their interests, or are we at odds on something that's more strategic in character?
Well, let me take that and move it directly into a discussion of how regional states are viewing our outreach to Iran. Part of this has to do with what's going on in Iraq, where Shiite militias are active and fighting in Tikrit, and elsewhere throughout the region. Are we sending bouquets to the Iranians, and how do our traditional allies view this part of our strategy?
Well, it's a wonderful question. It's timely because, as Dennis said, I think the perception in the region has been that we have been accommodating to the Iranians, and part of this has been the focus on the nuclear diplomacy and trying to reach a deal. A lot of us in America have been skeptical, obviously, of that assessment. But if you look at the dynamics, you have to start to wonder whether or not there is a sense of accommodation with the Iranians. And in the first instance, that comes in the counterterrorism lane, where there's a very clear reality that our interests are in alignment when fighting the Islamic State. That alignment, though, doesn't mean we necessarily have to accommodate the Iranians. But I think the administration has sent certain signals that suggest that there is more than just accommodation. There may be elements of cooperation here, or even acceptance of a more overt and aggressive Iranian role, for example, in Iraq. There have been questions as to whether or not the administration has been meek or mild in our policy in Syria, in part as a way of not ruffling the feathers of the mullahs in Tehran, and whether or not that has impacted what we've done in Syria and with President Assad. And then broader questions, as Dennis has alluded to, whether or not we are going to push back, for example, in places like Yemen, where the Houthi rebels, supported by the Iranians, have taken over, with very little comment or objection from the administration. And so all of that seems to suggest a degree of acceptance of more Iranian influence or hegemony, which is uncomfortable to our friends and allies, which seems to match and dovetail with these conspiracy theories that a lot of us had sort of poo-pooed, but in many ways begins to align with the realities of what the administration is doing and what's happening on the ground. And so I think there was a lot of confusion. I think the administration itself probably doesn't have a coherent strategy. And at the end of the day, the reality is that, like most of the foreign policy we've seen over the past couple of years, the administration is going from crisis to crisis and trying to manage what's happening without a broad long-term vision that's driving the steps that we see in places like Yemen, Iraq, Syria, and the rest of the Middle East.
When we come back in just a moment, I'm going to ask our panel the direct question: does America have a Shiite strategy in the Middle East? And we'll be back with that in just a minute. Again, my panelists are Juan Zarate. Juan is a senior advisor to the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the senior national security consultant and analyst for CBS News. One of our nation's leading counterterrorism and national security experts, he served in the administration of President George W. Bush as Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor. To his right is Dennis Ross, my colleague and counselor to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, which he rejoined after 3 years' service in the Obama administration, first in the State Department and then as Senior Director for the Central Region on the staff of the National Security Council. Dennis has a quarter-century experience at high levels of government, including White House tours in the Reagan, Bush, and Clinton administrations, and service as the President's Special Envoy for Middle East Peace. So, Dennis, does the administration have a Shiite strategy for the Middle East?
No, I don't think it does have a Shiite strategy. I think it has two priorities, and those priorities happen to be trying to roll back ISIS and reaching a nuclear deal with the Iranians. Now, the reality of those two priorities, those two objectives, has them aligning themselves, even if not by design, it is by consequence, effectively with the Iranians right now, at least in Iraq, clearly. And because of the concern about not doing anything that would make the achievement of the nuclear deal harder, there's a hesitancy to be doing anything that the Iranians wouldn't like in Syria, wouldn't like in Yemen. And the net effect is that we are adopting policies that make it appear as if we're looking at increasing Iranian hegemony in the region as not a problem. I think if you ask someone from the administration, would that be seen as a problem? The answer would be yes. But there isn't at this point a kind of full understanding of the implications of some of our current actions and the effect it seems to have on the region, and certainly how those actions are perceived in the region.
So it sounds like that by the end of this administration, if there is indeed a nuclear deal, and if there is important Iranian contribution to rolling back ISIS, Daesh, the Islamic State, then we could have a much different U.S.-Iran relationship by 2017 than we have today.
Maybe. And I think part of this has to do with the realities of Iranian foreign policy. You could imagine a much more amicable rapprochement between the countries, not just given a deal, but if the Iranians are more passive in terms of their influence around the world, and in particular their neighborhood. And so if they were to stop supporting proxies, if they were to try to help with resolution of the Syrian civil war, if they were to try to help with an accommodation in Yemen, maybe you start to see elements of a rapprochement, which I think would be welcome from the American side. I don't think there's a sort of a classic belligerency that's inherent in the relationship between the U.S. and Iran. There's a lot of skepticism and certainly now decades of mistrust and conflict, but I don't think there's anything fundamentally that draws us toward conflict. That said, I don't see any evidence that the Iranian leadership wants to change its behavior beyond the nuclear file, and even that has to be tested and verified. And so I think by 2017 what you'll have is a real difficult situation if there is a nuclear deal, where we're likely having to ask ourselves, how do you contain Iranian influence and misdeeds while also preserving the elements of the nuclear deal? And how do you do that in a way that balances both interests? And oh, by the way, also reinforces the relationships and assurances you need with our Sunni Arab allies and Israeli allies?
Now, you, Dennis, mentioned two objectives: fighting ISIS and a nuclear deal. Former director of the CIA, General Petraeus, just recently said that we have our priorities wrong, that in fact Iran and what Iran represents in Syria and Iraq is a much bigger threat to our interests than ISIS. Is this a view that would be welcome in the administration today, and do you think he's right?
A, I think it would not be welcome in the administration today because it runs counter to what their priorities are. B, I tend to agree with him. I think, in effect, there's no reason why we can't act the way the Iranians do. They seem to have no problem negotiating a nuclear deal with us and trying to expand their influence in the region at the same time. I don't know why our posture can't be, we will compete with them to counter the growth of their influence, to ensure they don't change the regional balance of power, even as we negotiate a nuclear deal with them. I don't know why they can operate one way and without any concern for what our reaction might be, and somehow we have to be overly sensitive to what their reaction would be. I think there's a long history of them demonstrating they respect power. And I think it would be wise for us to make it clear we have no objection. Obviously, we see an interest in having a nuclear deal. There's a good, strong reason to find a diplomatic way to resolve our nuclear differences. But that doesn't mean that when we do that, we have to acquiesce in their seeking increasingly to change the regional balance of power in their favor. They are not a force for stability. They are not a force that is going to promote the respect for minority rights and pluralism. They are not a force for promoting what I would call a certain set of values in the region. And even if some of our traditional friends don't exactly embrace those values, they don't make it impossible to achieve them over time. Iran does.
Juan, let me shift gears for a moment, ask you about a different angle of American action in the Middle East in the war against ISIS, and specifically about comments from our new Secretary of Defense, Ashton Carter, the President's fourth Secretary of Defense, brought in especially to wage the war against ISIS. And one of his opening remarks was, I disagree with the President. We shouldn't have put a time limit on what we believe is the authorization for the use of military force. The President proposed 3 years. Mr. Carter said he thought that was a mistake. What's going on here?
Well, I think what we have is what is often seen as a slip in Washington, which is somebody telling the truth, right? and speaking his mind in a position of power, which is unusual. What you've had in recent memory is policymakers and certainly cabinet secretaries doing what they have to do, serving the president, and they serve at his pleasure, and certainly subscribing to the policy of the president sort of by definition, and then waiting until they leave to express dissent and alternate opinions. To Ashton Carter's credit, he is speaking his mind. When being asked by Congress for his opinion, he's giving it.
I apologize that we've just run out of time, but we're going to have more opportunities to come back to what leaders in our administration will be doing as the clock ticks down toward the end of the Obama administration. Thank you, Juan. Thank you, Dennis. Look forward to having you back again. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول التوتر بين أمريكا وحلفائها التقليديين في الشرق الأوسط، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhurra.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.